So good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining tonight's roundtable on Southeast Asia and our current geopolitical realities. My name is Ita, and I chair the Intellectual Pursuits Subcommittee in NUSS. So tonight, we are very honored to have with us Ambassador Ashok Mirpuri, who is our former Singapore ambassador to America. So Ambassador Ashok is also our very own NUS alumnus. He graduated in 1984, read political science. I graduated about 30 years later, having did the same thing. But I wish I'm half as accomplished as him. Ambassador Ashok, apart from serving as former ambassador to America, he also served as head of mission in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Australia. My friends in government and MFA tell me that Singapore sends our best diplomats to these four places: our immediate neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia, and the two superpowers, America and China. And Ambassador Ashok served in 3 out of these 4 most important, countries. So we are very honored to have you to share your insights, having had a ringside seat to all these exciting developments across your illustrious career. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Ambassador to share his views on the topic of tonight. We want to keep this, fireside chat intimate. After Ambassador speaks, we'll serve dinner and we have a free-flowing Q&A. But before you ask your questions, feel free to also introduce yourselves. So I'll pass the time to Ambassador.
Well, thank you all for coming on this evening. I didn't realize this intellectual pursuits section of NUSS. I would have sort of declined, because that makes it too elevated for me. But, first, everything is off the record, Chatham House rules. If you could just respect that, because it gives me that ability to say things a little bit more freely. As Ida said, I was a career diplomat for 39 years, served in missions in Washington, in Indonesia, in KL, in Canberra, and really saw many changes taking place in the world, even over these times. The past 2 years after I retired from government, I joined Temasek to international policy, which keeps me connected to the diplomatic world because I travel quite regularly to the places that I covered, other places as well, looking at how the changes are taking place around the world. I think I wanted to focus on Southeast Asia because for Singapore, it's really the heart of what we do. Most of my career was focused on Southeast Asia. I spent 13 years in Indonesia, 4 years in Malaysia. Australia in many ways is part of Southeast Asia as well. And even when I went to the United States in 2012, at that time, the Obama administration was doing the pivot to Asia. And they wanted to know more about Southeast Asia, how to connect. Interestingly, my successor in Washington, Liu Tak-Q, came from Beijing because now the Americans are very focused on China and the US-China competition. So you notice that there are a number of ambassadors in Washington, D.C., who have a China background. Kevin Rudd from Australia. The French ambassador also came from Beijing to Washington. So that's really that change of tone in how the U.S. looks at the region. I think that in many ways frames what we in Southeast Asia are starting to have to deal with. Which the US-China competition has made us really that pawn in a way that we were not before. Southeast Asia had its own status for a long time, particularly under previous U.S. administrations. China was working very hard to woo Southeast Asia as well. Now we've just become sort of a bit player. We're geographically still very central, but in many ways, because of the lack of ASEAN being able to do things together, we've become slightly less relevant for dealing with U.S.-China relations. We're still the meeting place where people come, and most people are expecting President Trump to come to KL this weekend for the US-ASEAN summit and potentially to witness the signing of the Cambodia-Thai peace agreement, which he says that he sort of helped to shepherd through. We will have the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang coming to the ASEAN. So we've become a place where leaders do meet, but where we need to do certain things ourselves to get the agenda moving forward in a much more positive way. And it's very important for Singapore, even the rest of the countries in the region, that we work closer together because each one of us by ourselves is very small. You can take Indonesia with 260 million people. the largest of Southeast Asia, but because they always held themselves back, being an equal partner to other Southeast Asian countries, they never really created a role for themselves much bigger than what they are. And you contrast that, say, in South Asia, where India plays a very significant role in SAARC. In Southeast Asia, Indonesia does not really play that leading role of trying to drive the ASEAN agenda forward. Each of the ASEAN countries themselves have domestic political issues. Malaysia has certain challenges today. Thailand has been changing governments and has just have a new government with a very uncertain future, because when the elections happen next year, this government will have to step down. Philippines, the corruption allegations against the government today. Vietnam, communist country, being driven, but even there, the corruption issues have started to emerge. Obviously, Myanmar having the civil war challenges, Cambodia dealing with scam issues, Laos tucked away in sort of a landlocked position. And this weekend, we'll have Timor-Leste join ASEAN as well. So that, in many ways, should be a plus, but there's a huge uncertainty. Is it going to be a minus? So what can we do in terms of looking ahead and how ASEAN and Southeast Asia needs to work together? I think we need to rethink about not just the politics, and we're going to deal with issues on South China Sea and others, but really what can we do together economically? ASEAN economic cooperation has not really taken off. There were all sorts of artificial attempts to create ASEAN projects and other things that really never quite were managed to engage the whole region together. I think there are two areas in which potentially the region can come a lot closer together. One is digital, around technology, what we can do better as a region of 10 or 11 working in the digital future. I think that one may get people more interested in how you can get connected better, how do you get that digital connectivity around the region. And that's one area in which I think Singapore should try and push together. The other area that maybe we can get something going is energy, how we can sell renewable energy around the region, trying to create an ASEAN power grid. Singapore's trying to buy power from some of the ASEAN countries. These are far more concrete areas than just general economic cooperation. If we can get digital and power grids going, I think it will be a little bit more positive. In 2 years' time, in 2027, Singapore will be ASEAN chair. Hopefully some of these ideas, some newer ideas, get pushed together so that we can work together. Because without ASEAN getting together to do things as a group, we will be bypassed by the other great powers. We've seen in many ways, and we can talk later about U.S. tariffs, what China's excess capacity impacting ASEAN, U.S. tariffs impacting ASEAN. We're really sort of on the receiving end of many sort of negative economic challenges. And that's really some of the geopolitical realities we're dealing with today. Let me stop there. You start serving the food, and then I can start taking questions. And we can get into a Q&A because I'm happy to talk while you guys eat.
Yeah, let's serve the appetizers. Maybe I'll just start off with the first question. I think I was reading the Foreign Affairs magazine, last month's issue, and there was this article about Southeast Asia in two halves. So you have mainland Southeast Asia, the likes of Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, pulling away, and falling within China's orbit. And then you have maritime Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines. These are all very dependent on, having the sea lines open for trade and commerce and typically gravitate towards America. So does such a view resonate with you? Is this the right frame of thing? Do you see that tug of war happening within, Southeast Asia?
There is a constant challenge because of US-China competition of people pulling in different directions. But no one wants to be entirely dependent on one or the other power. Take, for example, Myanmar. Myanmar is going through a civil war, borders with China. The Chinese are very concerned. There's scams happening in Myanmar. There's kidnappings happening. The sort of conflict spills over into China as well. Yet Myanmar itself still wants to engage with the US, even though the US may not be interested. So when Donald Trump corresponded with a senior general about tariffs, Myanmar's very happy. So I think that being able to work both sides is probably a better way than just being entirely dependent on one. Laos, for example. Laos is, because of the landlocked status, because of the power grid that they have over there connected to China, all the hydropower, even they want to connect better with Southeast Asia. So none of them really want to break away from ASEAN, because breaking away from ASEAN will leave them isolated. Myanmar, which has been disinvited from ASEAN meetings since 2021, has never said we're going to leave in a half. They still stay part of it. There's still a special envoy trying to get them to move forward. They may have elections this year. ASEAN will have to take a view on those elections, but they've never said we want to leave. Cambodia, even when they went to this conflict with Thailand, when President Trump put out there to say that, if you do not stop the conflict, I'm going to raise the tariffs, they nominated Trump for a Nobel Prize. So they wanted to keep connected with. So everyone will have to walk a certain fine line of where they want to be on the US-China continuum. On the other extreme, we have someone like Philippines, which really sees a threat from China because of the South China Sea, being challenged on a day-to-day basis across where the waters are. And in the previous American administration under Joe Biden, they found themselves getting closer to the US. This administration is slightly standoffish with the Philippines because they're not a significant trading partner. They got 20% tariffs like most of the other ASEAN countries. But even then, they're trying very hard to make sure that they're on the US side. Their relationship with China is probably the least best among the ASEAN countries if you look across the board. The others all try and manage both the relationship with China and the relationship with the US. No one's going to give up on the relationship with the US. I mean, each one, there are differences. Indonesia has now decided to buy Chinese fighter aircraft because they may be cheaper, they are available compared to US equipment. But, thank you. But even they do not want to upset the Americans. When the Gaza summit took place, peace summit took place, President Prabowo got on a plane and flew to Sharm el-Sheikh for the meeting. And Indonesia wants to be able to offer troops to whatever peace deal works out over there. So it's really walking that fine line, and that's really that challenge for ASEAN. How do you walk that fine line? And this distinction between continental Southeast Asia, sort of your Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and maritime Southeast Asia, that is more a geographical construct, but not really an ideological construct. Because the Thais are not able to lead this grouping. They should have been a natural partner leading Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Myanmar. But they're not, because they're in fact losing ground to the Vietnamese as well. So there's really no real obvious leader, and they would prefer to be connected with maritime Southeast Asia, which is, as you say, the more vibrant, economically driven part of it. Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, being able to push that through. So I do not see a difference in terms of splitting the region. It's an artificial region because we pulled together countries with very different histories, very different governments. You've got a monarchy still in Brunei. You've got a communist government in Vietnam. You've got super democracy in Indonesia, and gives certain different outcomes as well. Each one is really quite different. The economies are quite different. Singapore is hyper-global. Laos is landlocked. So you put a very unlikely group to come together. Yet, it is the most successful regional organization if you look around. I mentioned SAARC. SAARC is really non-existent. You've got the Organization of African States, too big, much harder to manage. The EU, very bureaucratic, much more driven by bureaucratic challenges and regulatory issues. We don't do that in ASEAN. So we try and keep that right balance going.
Anyone would like to ask a question? Yes.
Hi, good evening, Ambassador Ashok. My name is Tim. I graduated from NUS History, so basically fellow FAST alumni. I would like to just ask you that I believe a lot of us in this room, we went through the era where Pax Britannia handed over to Pax Americana, and now looking at the current state of the US, some people are saying Pax Americana is coming to a close. So maybe I'd like to just hear from you, how long do you think Pax Americana will continue so we can start to prepare some of our hedging strategies, and maybe who will be the next Pax waiting that we can start to invest our efforts in? Thank you.
Please start eating if you got your food. Don't wait. the transition of great powers is always a very difficult challenge. When the British had to give up their great power status to the Americans, they resisted for a very long time. Today, the Americans are not going to give up their great power status without a fight. They will stay very much, they want to stay very much connected and being that great power. And then, now I'll elaborate a little bit on that, but take the alternative. The alternative is not going to be a Pax Sinica with China really being the top sort of player, because many countries around the world are not that comfortable. You can if you just imagine what the Japanese might think about if you had China as a dominant power. You could wonder what the Indians would think about that if China was a dominant power. There'll be a huge amount of uncertainty and unhappiness about that. The Americans look very chaotic. If you watch the news every day, you see chaos all the time. But the Americans have certain strengths that they're not going to give up on. First, they have the strongest military in the world. Despite the military parade you saw on September 3rd in Beijing, the Americans still have the strongest military in the world. The Chinese military is untested. The Chinese military just sacked a number of generals. It's very challenging for them to be able to do what the Americans are able to do. Americans have fought wars. They have fought joint wars. You have seen their ability earlier this year to send B-2s from across the world to bomb Iran. Whether the outcome was what they wanted or not, very few countries have that capacity to be able to do that. So they've got very strong security power. With that security power, they have a significant number of alliances. They're not treating their allies very well now. The Europeans feel very unhappy about it. They're pushing them to spend more on defense. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, came here earlier this year for Shangri-La and said Southeast Asia, ASEAN must also spend more, East Asia must spend more on defense, up to 5%. But the fact is that countries are responding to that. They do not want to lose the US as their key alliance partner. Countries continue to buy US equipment. That's very important to them. Many NATO countries are buying the F-35. Singapore is buying the F-35. That makes you interoperable with the US military. So there's a very strong sort of alliance structure in that. Now, whether the US, if there was a Article 5 violation in Europe, if Russia sent a missile into Poland or into some of the Baltic states, whether the US will react or not, nobody knows. But they want to make sure that they stay connected to the US in terms of security policy. On economic policy, we all saw the tariffs. Everyone was very unhappy about the tariffs when President Trump put them out in April. But every country fell over themselves to negotiate with the US. It's not like they said we can walk away from the US. There was no alternative. The WTO is not an alternative. You couldn't go and sue them. So you had to then get into the economic relationship with the US, including China. China now, of course, has built their own leverage of how they want to manage with the US, but they still need to sell products to the US. They're still interdependent with the US, and the US is interdependent with them. So the US retains a very strong economic foothold in the global economy, and no one's going to give it up. I mean, 60% or 70% of global capital today is going to the United States. It's not going to India, it's not going to China, it's not going to Africa. Money is all flowing towards the US. So that keeps the US really that very significant partner. The third thing is technology. You see the best technology coming out of the US. When we talk about AI, I know China's got DeepSeek and China's got applications, but the entire sort of AI infrastructure today is still being driven by the US. And the sort of expenditure into data centers, the expenditure into AI, that still keeps driving the technology, and people expect that that's going to be a very significant boost for the US economy if they retain that position in terms of being a technology leader. Again, you see bits and pieces that make you question some of this. They don't want to give visas to qualified engineers to come in. They're sort of taking away R&D money from universities. But in the end, they will still continue to hold that. And the fourth one is probably the most important. It's the US dollar. The US dollar is the global currency that everybody uses. Saudi Arabia sells oil, they sell it in US dollars. All transactions take place in the US dollars. There's a SWIFT system that connects all of us through the US currency. And there is no alternative. people have tried to look at alternatives. The euro tried to be an alternative. It is not an alternative. Obviously, the pound is no longer a possible alternative. The Chinese do not have a capital account that allows them to open up to take over being an alternative. And I cannot see the Indians trading with the Chinese renminbi. So where are you going to go? And that power of the dollar is so significant for the US, not just for the economy, it also gives them that ability to use economic sanctions. So all the export controls, economic sanctions is all around the US dollar. That gives them a strong stranglehold in terms of that position of still being the dominant country in the world. Because the alternative to the US not being there is probably more chaos rather than anything else. It's not that you have a nice, smooth transition into some other power. It's not necessarily the US will retain this for a very long time, but I would expect that for the immediate future, for the foreseeable future, that the US will remain that dominant player and they're not going to give up that place very easily. Now, you mentioned hedging. I think every country has to hedge. And you start seeing some of those hedging strategies. In Southeast Asia, you see that countries, yes, we may have to trade bilaterally with the US because they use tariff leverage on all of us. But you're starting to see people having conversations around the CPTPP, which does not include the US, including Europeans thinking about a CPTPP. A few weeks ago, Singapore launched something called FITP, Future of Investment and Trade Partnership, with smaller countries. So people are looking at alternatives, not necessarily significant hedging alternatives, but they are looking what can we do differently, because there's a sense that we cannot be entirely reliant on the US. There's a sense that maybe we cannot fully trust the US. You can ask the Indians about that, because having come very close to a deal and the US suddenly tears up the whole deal and say and put a 50% tariff because you buy Russian oil, I think the Indians have been very disappointed by that. They will still do a deal with the US, but they'll be looking for alternatives as well.
No. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ashok. Yeah, I'm Claire. I graduated from NUS MBA just this year, and I'm from Taiwan. So actually, I have a lot to speak about the US because, as you mentioned, US is still a very strong country. We also buy a lot of weapons from the US, that is for sure. But I just want to respond to what you just said earlier, because you said that, because one thing that you mentioned that really made me think more is that in Southeast Asia, the countries don't really work together. That is something I didn't really notice, but I'm very thankful that you pointed that out. Because just think of the US, it's like you can call it a region. And India is big enough, it can be a region as well. China is big enough to be a region. And Southeast Asia is actually made up of like really small countries. Not very small countries, but countries. Yeah, so it can be a region, and if they work together, they can actually be very powerful, I believe. But I'm saying that I'm seeing there are a lot of like products that are like used. Like for example, like DBS. If you look into the DBS app, you can see that you can actually transfer money to Thailand and also Malaysia. So I think that is something that we're seeing, like they're actually working together. And for example, Grab, you can actually download Grab and use it in Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore. So it's actually, I think they're working together. But my real question for you is, I'm a PR right now, as a PR or citizen or foreigner working in Singapore, living in Singapore, what can we do? Or what kind of what are the goals that you would like us to achieve in order to achieve what you just mentioned, like people working together around Southeast Asia? So that's my question. As a little person living in Singapore, what can we do? What should we learn? Yeah.
Well, when you're ready, you should become a Singapore citizen. Then that's the best thing. Since you're already halfway there, you might as well go and become a Singapore citizen. Best passport in the world. And travel everywhere with the Singapore passport. No issue. But, Singapore, in a way, is open to people coming from outside. Sometimes there's some pushback, but I think that given our falling fertility rate, given our demographic challenges, Singapore keeps welcoming people in from outside. I think that's a useful sort of balance that they come in, they make Singapore a little bit more cosmopolitan, and they make us more open and connected to the world. And I think most of us here, those who are born in Singapore, had a parent or a grandparent who came from outside Singapore anyway. It's not like, they were sort of everyone was here for, 10 generations or something like that. Everyone who looked back would have had, that connection from outside. On the Southeast Asia thing, geographically and population-wise, we're 700 million people. That's bigger than the EU, actually, and obviously bigger than the US, half the size of India and half the size of China. The challenge is getting a coherence around this, that now that we're 700 million, what can we do together? And that's really that difficulty for the ASEAN countries. There are countries like Laos that basically see ASEAN as a organization that gives aid to the weaker countries. So they do not bring anything except, okay, you need to give us aid so that we can help. Not that they are able to sort of develop anything else. Then we're facing the challenge of being in the middle of the US and China. With the US, I spoke about the tariffs, that started to impact all the ASEAN countries. ASEAN did not negotiate as a group against the US because Singapore will say we have an FTA with the US. The US is a surplus with us. Why should we negotiate with countries like Vietnam that had 44% tariffs? So they had to bring it down to 20%. Singapore still got a 10% tariff. So every ASEAN country had to negotiate on their own. It's quite different in the EU. When the EU negotiated with the US, they negotiated as a group. Not necessarily that successfully, but they still negotiated as a group. ASEAN did it all individually. Our challenge now with China is that as China is tariffed sending their goods to the US, and as tariffs sending their goods to the EU, all their excess capacity is now coming to Southeast Asia. So you're starting to see small and medium-sized enterprises in Southeast Asia being flooded by Chinese goods. They're starting to come in, and for Singapore, it doesn't really matter because the cheap Chinese goods is not a bad thing. But in Indonesia, when factories have to shut down because they cannot compete against Chinese goods, that becomes a big problem for them. And so it's trying to find that balance. If in your MBA class you were talking about Southeast Asia, then hopefully you can get more entrepreneurs like Grab or like Sea that set up and then create a Southeast Asian ecosystem around what they're trying to do. It's hard, it's difficult. I mean, even Grab now is probably on a better footing, but not always easy. Sea is now through Shopee available through most of the region, but you've got to have very specific strategies in different countries how to deal with it. But I think the region should do more. I think young people in the region should look much more at ASEAN as a grouping, but it is difficult. Even as you travel around the region, it's not easy to get into every country. The lines to get in for ASEAN are not any easier. Indonesia now has biometric entry for Singaporeans. Malaysia has some of that. Thailand still doesn't have that yet. So it becomes much more complicated. So I think there are things that can be done, but it's not just for the governments to do it, it's also for companies and for young people to do some of these things.
Name's Tiwari, retired SAF officer. Basically, my question is pertaining to how important Southeast Asia is to the world. It's really the choke point, Malacca Straits, and of course, access via the South China Sea. And to layer that with the US-China conflict, the potential for it happening, particularly in regards to Taiwan. And another layer being the US-Singapore Strategic Agreement, which was signed in 1990 for access to our naval bases for the US naval power, which I do know there's an article which absolves us to keep out of any conflict. We will not be required to host US ships should a conflict happen. But the question really is, how do we practically because a conflict doesn't occur overnight, there is always a lead up to it. So in the lead up, at which point will we stop the US ships from calling at our naval bases? And so really, your thoughts on this?
Fortunately, I don't have to make decisions like that. First, you came from the SAF. Singapore's mental model of threat is not China, it's not India, it's not the US, it's not Australia. It's really our immediate neighbors. And having served as ambassador in both our immediate neighbors, I'm happy to say that this has changed. We have a far more positive relationship with our neighbors than we had when I first started in the diplomatic service. We now have a defense cooperation agreement with Indonesia, which covers the flight information region, which covers the extradition treaty. I tried to do it when I was ambassador. It didn't succeed. 2007, under the previous president and the current president, who was defense minister, we managed to get a defense cooperation agreement going. And that's very positive. Militaries always have to still plan for worst-case scenarios, and I'm sure SAF planned for a worst-case scenario, but I think that having moved the relationship from essentially confrontasi in 1963 to 65, and for those of you who don't know, Indonesia had declared Singapore and Malaysia under confrontation, and our troops are fighting in Sabah, Kalimantan, and bits and pieces like that. To have gone from there to where we are today is a huge, significant improvement in our strategic space with Indonesia over 60 years. With Malaysia, governments like I was there when Dr. Mahathir was Prime Minister in 2002. It was a little bit more challenging, but subsequent Prime Ministers have been far more positive about dealing with Singapore. And even when Dr. Mahathir came back second time, he did say, okay, the water price had never been adjusted. Let me raise the water issue again. But that was really an old horse that, nobody cares if he keeps flogging on about it, So we resolved the Pedra Branca issue by going to the International Court of Justice. That was also always an issue of some sensitivity to both sides. So we took it out to a third party to resolve it. Yeah, occasionally the Johor questioned some of that, but we've got a certain process going. We are together in the 5-power defense arrangements with the Australians, the New Zealanders, and the British. And so it's a much, much better strategic environment for Singapore in terms of our neighbors. And this is really our immediate sort of concerns. There are concerns, and these sort of emerged in the past 25 years, about terrorism. And most of the terrorism will be coming from the region. We saw even the 9/11 terrorists had trained in parts of the region, in southern Philippines, and went through Malaysia, Indonesians who did that. So, but the cooperation among the security groups is very positive. So it again keeps the situation under control. Then when you talk about sort of the wider regional sort of outlook, yes, we've opened our military facilities up for the US to use since 1990. And I think that has given more security, not just to Singapore, but the whole region. If you remember, the reason why we opened our facilities up to the US was because the Philippines had asked the US to leave the bases in Clark and Subic in 1988 or something like that. Now, much to their regret, they wish they still, in fact, now they have something called EDCA, Enhanced Cooperation and Defense Agreement. They wish they could bring the Americans back in the way that they were in Clark and Subic. So that time has passed already. And, the Americans felt that if they did not have an active presence in the region, they would have to be only in Guam, which is the closest place, and Okinawa. So Singapore said, okay, why don't you come and use our facilities over here? These are Singapore facilities. They're not American bases. And I think that was an important sort of part of how it was framed. And it helped build up a security relationship because, as you mentioned at the start, Southeast Asia is the choke point between the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. If the Americans have a conflict in the Middle East, they will need forces from Hawaii to get across to the Middle East and vice versa. So we are the choke point, not necessarily the only sort of place where they can go through because they can actually go down through the south, through the Sunda Straits. I mean, yes, the Straits of Malacca is easier, shorter, much quicker. but there are alternative routes for them to go through. And but it keeps Southeast Asia very much in their sort of security thinking of where they want to deal with the region. But the way that, we have allowed the US to use its facilities is, as you said, under Singapore's terms. And the question of when will we say, no, you cannot use the facilities, will really be a decision to be made depending on circumstances as it stands. There's no sort of automatic, unlike NATO, which is automatic granting, we're not an ally of the United States. We are what they call a major security cooperation partner. So it's quite different from where we are. And the US, on their part, has also allowed us to use their bases. We have Air Force units in Idaho, coming soon to Arkansas, in Arizona, which very few other countries have. So there's a very close cooperation with them, and which I think you don't want to test it by a conflict of them saying no or us saying no. There's a interesting book written by a defense writer, I forget the name now, Singaporean, who said that, David Boy, Pukul Habis, where the Americans actually disallow Singapore aircraft from the continental US to come back to Singapore. So it's not just a one way that we can say no to them, they can say no to us as well, according to David's sort of thesis.
Just stop our basing of aircraft in Guam. That's the latest.
That was a different sort of cost consideration, as far as I know. Very expensive. But so the Americans could have stopped that as well. So I think by keeping a warm relationship with them, then you sort of, keep your strategic sort of environment fairly secure.
The peacetime landscape, that is really like one friends to everyone. But the question is when a conflict erupts and the potential for conflict, whether in Acre Straits, South China Sea or Taiwan, is increasingly very higher, and with somebody who is not predictable.
Who, Donald Trump?
In the White House. Okay, no, so that's why I think our planners and our thinkers would really address these booms like horns.
You come from a military background, and so you plan for the worst case scenario. Ajit and I come from a diplomatic background. We're far more optimistic about the world than military planners. So you try and avoid conflict by, as Churchill used to say, Giorgio is better than war. So we talk people to the ground and you don't go to war. But I understand military planners thinking you would have planned for the worst case. And if you remember, Admiral Davidson, when he was Indo-PACOM commander, had said that by 2027, the Chinese will have the capacity to take over Taiwan. Now, this number is being debated in significant amount of forums in the United States. Is 2027 the date when the U.S., when China may potentially attack Taiwan? And people put all sorts of reasons around it. Xi Jinping will have to go for his fourth term, and he wants to do that. The U.S. may be distracted by their own thing. But essentially, as I spoke to the people in Indo-PACOM, the number is just a planning number. It is a number based on data that says that at this particular point, the Chinese will have more ships than the American has more ships. Because the Americans sort of, the way the budget had been run, the ships were sort of being taken out of service and new ships were not coming on. The new ships come on, and by 2032, I think the Americans will have dominance again in naval craft. So Admiral Davidson was trying to draw attention of Congress to say, by 2027, we're going to lose our ability to sort of be the top dog in the region. Now, that's U.S. budgetary issues, U.S. congressional issues, but he had to put a planning number, and people have now become very focused on that planning number. And so that is really that planners. But whether President Trump, I don't see him as a warmonger. President Trump actually doesn't like war. He wants a Nobel Prize. He wants a Nobel Prize partly for vanity, because Obama got the prize and he says, how come I don't get the prize? Yet he's working very hard to solve peace. No matter how much you think about that Gaza agreement that was signed 2 weeks ago, it at least stopped something, which the Biden administration was unable to do since October. But they were not able to enforce it because no one could go to Netanyahu and stop it. So at least Donald Trump may not endure. Every day I keep hearing, the Hamas is sort of violating the ceasefire, but at least it stopped, and humanitarian aid is able to get into Gaza as well. The UN is able to put humanitarian aid. The fact that the Indonesians now want to provide part of the stabilizing force is positive. I mean, there's something there that I think you have to give some credit to Donald Trump for. Steve Witkoff, whoever it is. In Cambodia and Thailand, he used trade leverage to get him to stop fighting. Now, both the Cambodians and Thais particularly are very unhappy about it, but they still stopped. In India and Pakistan, he stepped. First, they said it's not our problem. If you remember, J.D. Vance said this is not our problem. And then Marco Rubio came in and tried something. And then Trump came in and tried to call Modi, and then he dealt with the Pakistan army. And I think the Indians had different reasons because they never wanted to be seen as a hyphenated conflict, India-Pakistan. They said, we will deal with Pakistan on our own. But, he does not like to see these conflicts. Now, we can laugh at him, he's saying peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan and, Albania and Azerbaijan, But I think his instinct is not to go to conflict. He doesn't want to send American troops to war. That's one thing that he was very unhappy about the Iraq war. And if you let me finish. And so he wants to sort of make sure the American troops are not committed. He wants to make sure the U.S. is not overcommitted on this. So yes, you can have in the Taiwan situation, there is a status quo, there is a very unstable status quo. And the three parties in that status quo are obviously Taiwan, China, and the United States. And you just hope that no party miscalculates and lets that status quo fall off. And so, countries around will have to make decisions based on how that status quo may effectively fall off. But I think that the Americans have been told time and again, Taiwan is not like Ukraine. The UN will not come together to pull together a resolution around Taiwan. And there are other ways for the Chinese to pressure Taiwan, embargoes and things like that. But you'll just see how that goes. Thank you.
Now, on a related note, just wanted to seek your views on broader US-China geostrategic rivalry. What do you think is the end game for both America and China? Is America just seeking to maintain hegemony, or is China just seeking to be dominant, number one? Or are we missing something? Maybe you can enlighten us on that.
Yeah. I think the Chinese are comfortable with the current status quo. Number two, but recognized as a significant number two, not a minor number two. They have emerged now as a great power, and I think we have to appreciate that. They have got economic power, they've got military power. I don't think they want to be in the current context, number one. Number one comes with a lot of stress and pain, which you see the Americans having to do. I don't see the Chinese stepping up to do things that the Americans do in the Middle East. They've not had that capacity to be able to do that. I don't see them overly involving themselves. I mean, in the Russia-Ukraine thing, they've been apparently supplying the Russians. And but they want to be recognized as an almost equal to the U.S. Their concern is that the U.S., which has been number one for so long, is not going to give up the power that they had, as I mentioned earlier. And in not giving up the power, they will chop the Chinese down at the knees, so that the Chinese will not be a significant number two, but will be a weaker number two. So you see that around, say, chips. When, do we sell chips? Do we not sell chips? Can we sell the best chips? Can we sell other chips, make them dependent on us? You see that in other parts of the relationship, where in the U.S. today, there's a sense that we should not let China be more dominant. The Chinese came up in 2015 with something called Made in China 2025, which is this year. They've stopped talking about that now, because that drew the attention of the American planners that China actually wants to take technological lead around the US. If you look today, China has a lead in EV vehicles. China has a lead in battery technology. China has a lead in solar. China probably has a lead around energy transition. And the US has said we're still going for fossil fuels. And anyone looking at the world of climate change says that this is not a sustainable model. But they don't want the Chinese to get ahead on this, so they disallow Chinese EVs coming into the US. They disallow Chinese battery companies setting up in the US. Governors have stopped CATL opening up in the US. So it does become a little bit more competitive between the two of them. The Chinese, for their part, have their own domestic challenges to deal with. The Chinese economy is not really pushing ahead the way it used to do before. Their property sector, their financial sector has got certain problems. And their technology still relies very much on the US. There was a criticism that the Chinese basically stole all US technology and redid it. I think today you really do see real innovation in China as well. So the two of them are really neck and neck with each other. Neither wants to give up the role, but China does not want to take on some of those global responsibilities that we see the US playing. And so that's really quite different. The Chinese in this current circumstance are dealing with President Trump, having dealt with him the first time in the first administration, has got far more leverage today. They've now learned how to use critical minerals or rare earth elements in their sort of negotiations. They've held back on buying soybeans, so they have that sort of ability to maybe stop some of that connection with the US. I think they want to be far more independent of the US in many ways. And the US will still need to sell soybeans to China. We're not going to have a happy transition between the two parties. There's going to be constant competition between them, sniping on the edges, distrust on both sides. Whatever deal President Trump may sign with Xi Jinping next week in Korea, or when he makes a state visit to China next year, the question is how long will it endure? In the first term, we did see him sign a deal. The deal did not last very long. So it's really how long these things endure. So there's going to be a constant level of competition, but if they can find some balance to avoid miscommunication, miscalculation, I think that will be better for both sides.
Many no those birds.
Hi, my name is Effendi, graduated in 2002. I just have quick questions. It seems like, I don't know whether my perception is correct or not, but it seems like the world is not ready for China to be number one. Maybe you can ask, maybe can advise whether this is this the case or not. If that's the case, what do you think that China can, why is that the case? And what do you think that China can do to have soothe the perception among the majority of countries in the world to accept them to be like, at least parallel to the US?
I don't think China wants to be number one.
That's I agree as well. But it seems like the world doesn't want to be number one as well.
Well, first you have to want it. Then you do the right things. The Chinese are very internally focused. They see the rest of the world is really not relevant to them. They speak about 5,000 years of history. The rest of us are nowhere near their capacity of civilizational thought, and they see themselves as the middle kingdom, and the rest of us really don't qualify. All of us are just outsiders to them. And so that's one priority, is domestic. And the Chinese do have very significant issues within their country as well. Putting aside Taiwan, on the west, with Xinjiang and some of the other parts, Central Asia, they have a lot of challenges over there. They have not really been able to develop the inland parts of China. And you compare that with the US, where because of the US system, because states have a lot of independent authority within the federal system, states have been able to compete among themselves quite effectively, unlike in China. China, only the East Coast has developed, the rest really hasn't quite taken off as much. They put infrastructure, but you really don't have, everyone wants to move to the East Coast for the better job. So there's domestic issues within China. There's a sense that we're the more superior civilization to all of you, and you really don't consider. But also Chinese diplomacy and Chinese defense policy does not make them a very attractive partner. They have got sharp elbows that go around and push you out of the way. And you may have seen videos of this, how their security guys are very pushy when they walk into a room. They told Singapore Foreign Minister maybe 15 years ago, we are big and you are small. Singapore knows we are small. We don't need people to remind us that we are small. Because that's a undiplomatic way of dealing with things. Sort of, yeah, we know our place in the world, but in a way at the UN, each one of us has one vote, and you have to respect that sovereignty of smaller countries like Singapore. The Chinese have very sharp elbows. They do not have sort of effective diplomacy to deal with the world. When they do aid and assistance to the rest of the world, it comes with a lot of caveats, and it comes with a lot of almost ransom, like ask the Sri Lankans about Belt and Road and how unhappy they were at the end of it. So I think it will take a while for China to understand the world as it is. Part of their excuse is that we didn't shape the current world order. After the end of the Second World War, they never had because they were still fighting their own civil war and only got the CCP only came into office in 1949. For a long time, Taiwan was holding their seat in the UN. They said, we didn't shape the world order. Why should we defend this world order? They question things like the UN Law of the Sea Convention because they said this is not really what we do. So until they can accept the world order, the rest of us will still feel very uncomfortable, with them in some fashion. And then their neighbors, because of the long history with Japan, the sort of Second World War, pre-Second World War history with Japan, they haven't forgiven the Japanese. And the Japanese are very suspicious of them. It was interesting when Deputy Prime Minister Gan Kim-yong went to the military parade in Beijing in September, which was meant to sort of celebrate 80 years of the end of the anti-fascist war, which was targeted at Japan. He said that, he put this out on his Facebook, in Singapore, we remember history, but we always keep looking forward. The Chinese keep replaying that history of Japan because for their own domestic nationalist reasons. That doesn't make the Japanese feel very comfortable with them. Today you see them maybe having a better relationship with Russia. I don't think this can last very long given the sort of geography that they share. The Chinese believe the Russians took some of their territory after the wars and took advantage of them as well. So China needs to rethink how they do their defense and security policy. These, clashes in the South China Sea with the Philippines most publicly, but with other Southeast Asian countries. China's got so much water, they can give up one atoll to the Philippines. Seriously, It's like Singapore and Malaysia fighting over Petra Branca. The tiny dot, and Malaysia still wants to fight over it. Okay, take it to the ICJ. China refuses to use international mechanisms to solve this. When the Philippines took them to the International Tribunal, they refused to accept it. It's just a small atoll. I mean, you seriously go and see these things. These are little tiny dots. They make no strategic difference for China. Can China feel big enough to say, I'm going to give it up? No, because it goes back to your civilization. I don't know how they drew this 9-dash line map, 11-dash line map. Even the KMT sort of accepted these maps. So when you look at these things and you look at their borders and you say, maybe I feel a little bit more suspicious of them, whether I'm in India, whether I'm a Russia, whether I'm a Central Asian state. So they keep telling us we've got 14 neighbors, all of them are hostile, but that hostility comes from you. And the US is, on the hand, very lucky. 2 neighbors, Canada and Mexico, completely comfortable with them, but the US is being hostile to them now, if you look at the trade agenda. So it will take a long time for countries in the world to accept China as a global leader. And the Chinese themselves don't really want it. They don't want to play the rules, but take on that role of rule-based order. They want to shape it only in their own way.
So back then, there was this talk of China having this wolf warrior diplomacy. Has that tone in China's diplomacy changed?
Yes, largely, and no, in certain bits they have not changed. I think that the instruction has gone out to them to tone down the wolf warrior diplomacy, which was targeted largely at European countries, a little bit at Southeast Asia, obviously at the US. They now have a very polite, well-accepted ambassador in Washington, D.C., Xie Feng, who came in 2023 just as I was leaving. Please start eating if you have your food. Don't wait for me. They just removed one of their trade negotiators because Howard Lutnick or Scott Besson said he came to the US in August and was very rude. But I think the instinct sometimes is still there to be a bit wolf warrior. But somewhere along the way, whether it was just a regular change of ambassadors, that he was due to come back in Geneva, or whether it was a reflection that we don't want to, at the time when you're trying to negotiate a good deal with the US, let's not unnecessarily complicate things. But I think the wolf warrior instinct will come up. I compare that with the Americans. The Americans are also tough negotiators. But because we're so used to having them around, maybe we kind of accept that they will bully us, and they bully us in a gentle way. They use soft power to bully us rather than necessarily hard power. The Latin Americans are not very happy with them, but for the rest of the world, we've kind of got used to the US. You turn to them when you have a problem, and they may come and help you. And they may turn to you and put pressure on you, and they know how to do it. I've dealt all my career with many American diplomats, and most of them are charming, friendly people. Of course, if the instruction to be tough, they will be tough with you. And there are countries, particularly in Central America, Cuba, which I visited several times, are very unhappy with the Americans because they find the embargo quite difficult for them to deal with. Today, Venezuela is basically being a victim of U.S. gunboat diplomacy. Colombia may now be the next victim of U.S. gunboat diplomacy as well. So there are things that the U.S. does that people don't feel completely comfortable with. But the Chinese people just are maybe tougher on them in many ways because the Chinese themselves don't present themselves adequately.
There's a precisely. That's our comment in the question. Yeah.
It's a question on unipolarity and multipolarity. 1989, after the breath of Soviet Union, largely the US was a unipolar power globally from 89 to now. The two questions. Firstly, what is Singapore's position? Would you prefer unipolarity of Americans, or would it be more beneficial for Singapore to have a multi-polar world? That's the first question. Second question is interrelated in the sense that what will benefit Singapore more? Oh wait, when do you think, are we already at a multipolar moment in global geopolitics, or are we looking at the next 5 years to reach a multipolar moment with say ours being the leaning Europe, India, Southeast Asia, and China, of course, as the other poles?
Well, first, I'm not in the government anymore, so I don't speak for the government. So I give you my personal thinking about these things. The US had a moment with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, where they had a what do you call unipolar moment. China really had not. Also, the same year of the fall of the Berlin Wall was the Tiananmen Square incidents as well. So China was also not really treated as a member of the international community. So it was really a moment for the US to really press ahead. They squandered some of that subsequently after 9/11, partly the shock of 9/11, 2001, the invasion of Afghanistan, the subsequent invasion of Iraq. They squandered some of that ability to be that sort of unipolar country. They're still the most powerful. But in a way, people started questioning that power. China emerged after joining WTO to join the WTO very much at the US urging and the US help. And they came out and became an economic competitor in their own right. So between 1990 to where we are today, 35 years, the world has changed. So we cannot keep saying maybe that's a better version. Today you've got the UN, celebrated 80 years last month in New York. But UN really reflects the world at the end of World War II. 5 major powers, each claiming veto roles. Each one has had a change in their own position. The Soviet Union, which then became Russia, obviously no longer playing a role of a great power, except a spoiler. They veto every significant resolution. China, which was actually not there in 1945, it was Taiwan that was there. Now changing and say, the rules were not written by us, therefore we should not entirely follow these rules. The British, a shell of it themselves, quite different. The French, if you watch French politics, complete chaos. And then the United States, still the dominant power. And then where's the role for India? Where's the role for Japan? Where's the role for Brazil? Where's the role for Germany? So we are actually living in several layers of worlds. A world of 1945, a world of 1990, a world of post-Iraq United States. And we're trying to freeze it everywhere, but it keeps changing. So Singapore and other countries have to now start adapting to these changes, where they may have been comfortable with a dominant United States. They also know they've got to start thinking of alternatives. In a way, the United States is the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And the devil you don't may be, in fact, global chaos because of the uncertainty, which you can see regional conflicts coming up that no one wants to deal with. When the Houthis start launching missiles in the Red Sea, it was only the US that could organize countries to go. The Chinese didn't step in, even though their ships go through the Red Sea as well. So you do have these challenges of what you want to deal with. When you look we're kind of in what they call a plastic moment. Things are starting to change. And they will change in ways that we cannot anticipate today. So the good foreign ministries, the good defense ministries will plan for these changes without giving up some of the certainties they have, but anticipate some of the uncertainties and say, how do we adjust to this? The business community similarly has to plan for some of these things. Well, if you think of the world of business today, the fact that the United States tells NVIDIA, you can sell chips to China, but you give me 15% tax. That sort of industrial economic policy you could never have imagined the US doing before. So, and other countries are doing similar things as well. So when the Chinese run state-owned enterprises and the Americans are creating their own state-owned enterprise things through Intel by getting people to invest in Intel, you wonder which world are we going to be dealing with economically, business-wise, security-wise. So, as I say, it's a plastic moment. Things are very malleable. They may change in some parts very suddenly and in some parts very slowly. In the Middle East, we all thought that the Trump administration, the United States, wanted to withdraw from the Middle East, not just the Trump, the previous administrations. The Obama pivot to Asia was really to spend less time in the Middle East. It keeps sucking in the Americans. And you would think under the logics that we had that because of the dependence on Saudi oil and the Middle East oil, the Americans with their own energy independence actually don't need the Middle East anymore. But they're still keeping sucked in. And so, these things change, but they don't change. And so you just have to keep yourself nimble and flexible enough to decide, sometimes issue by issue, sometimes interest by interest. For countries like Singapore, and I think most of our neighbors, a stable multilateral order is best. We don't really need one big power sort of running this whole thing. But the UN has not functioned. Many UN agencies themselves have stopped functioning. You look at something like the WHO, because of the loss of US funding, it's just been incapable now of being able to do a lot of support. The Paris Agreement, which deals with climate change, which everyone's very concerned about, with the US not attending anymore, other countries will start stepping away from it well. So how do you find a balance in this multilateral? That's really the big challenge.
No, you made a very interesting point regarding the implications of China-US relations, trade relations with Southeast Asia. And you mentioned Indonesia as an example, where factories are closing down and all. My question is first, what will the impact be if this is sustained? Second, what are the opportunities for Southeast Asian countries in this context of US-China trade tension? What are the opportunities, what are the possible opportunities for these countries, where we can go from here?
Thank you. Ajit used to be a former diplomat like me, so he spent many times in many different countries. For a while, the opportunity was China plus one. As companies started diversifying out of China, the plus one usually was Southeast Asia. And Vietnam had a significant number of Chinese companies moving into Vietnam as part of that plus one strategy. The US has now put a block on that through transshipment tax of 40%. Vietnam has got a tariff of 20%, but a transshipment, they haven't quite fully worked out the details, but from what I read, there's going to be 40% tariffs on these goods. Companies are rethinking there's China plus one. The resilience of supply chains has become a very significant issue for people, that they're pulling back many of their industries into their own geographies. COVID really brought that to mind when you had masks not being available in the US and only in China. So today, the US says you have to start manufacturing masks in the US as well. Defense production. I think with Southeast Asia, it's how do we harness the power of our 700 million people to be better faced both domestically but also externally? How can we sort of use our geography, which is significant, use our connections around the world? Southeast Asians, we're a mix of the world. The Chinese are here, the Indians are here, the Indonesians, Malay population is here. The West is very comfortable with Southeast Asia. How can we use that to our own advantage? We haven't quite been able to fully harness it. Singapore does it, but in a certain small way. The other countries haven't quite been able to do it. And so we've got to find opportunities. With technology, it's going to be very difficult because the technology standards in the region are so different. That I think that's where normally you'd like to see Southeast Asia creating some indigenous technologies that they can put out. We really not be able to do that. In terms of capital markets, we haven't been able to have a combined capital market. Stock exchanges still compete among themselves. Do you list in Thai company? Do you list in Bangkok? Or do you list in Singapore? Or do you list in the US? So how can we do some of that? There's a lot that can be done, but it takes a certain focused mind to be able to do it. I don't see that yet in many of the countries. So Indonesia has the ability to lead on these things because they're the biggest. But again, they're very domestically sort of focused at the moment.
Ambassador, you've talked a lot about the geopolitics. I would like to ask you a question about how do you see technology, especially the advent of AI that creates so many different scenarios, and the religiousness. Because these are two things in the world today, technology and religion, that can create a lot of issues, and they are creating, as you can see in Europe and you can see in America. How do you see these two areas affecting the geopolitics going forward for Southeast Asia?
I don't see these as necessarily negative. They become negative depending on how people use these for their own reasons. I think religion generally is good. That we have, in particularly Southeast Asia, we have a multitude of religions. We just celebrated Deepavali. Hari Raya, you have Christmas, you have, Pesach. And I think that's a unique strength in Southeast Asia. We live with every religion. I have grandsons. Every religious festival, they dress up in the outfit of that and go to school. They learn about Islam, they learn about Hinduism, they learn about Christianity. And there's a certain syncretic nature in how we deal it. Now, that's not necessarily the case in other parts of the world. Religion is becoming a little bit more significant in parts of Europe, particularly in the Eastern Europe. It's partly a reaction sometimes to economic change as well. Then people feel that maybe with religion, they can sort of find their spiritual world in that fashion. In the US, it's become, with this Charlie Kirk killing, became far more challenging and difficult. But I think everyone's quite careful about playing the religious card in the US. Technology is a little bit more different. Again, we've generally seen technology for the past centuries as generally a good. There have been people that oppose technology, the Luddites, who oppose letting there be cars because they wanted a horse and buggy. Luddites who opposed the Industrial Revolution. People feel disjointed and discombobulated by technology. There are digital natives. Your children are probably far more efficient dealing with these things than I am in my generation. And they feel far more comfortable with it. They don't think about it necessarily always in a negative way. I think the challenge with technology today is that maybe the technology has gotten bigger than the state. As long as the state was able to regulate technologies, whether it was the flying machine or the driving machine or the industrial machine, people felt kind of comfortable. Today, when the state is no longer able to necessarily regulate because the technology is moving so much quicker, now we're worrying more about scams and things like that because we just finding it hard to regulate. And it's not just Singapore problem; it's an everybody problem. And so when your state looks helpless, then people feel even more nervous. And there are elements in the technology that people say they want to recreate human intelligence, artificial generative intelligence. There are these technologists who have got very big platforms to claim that, they want to recreate a human mind. That makes people very nervous as well. Because we don't mind having technology. We don't mind if it's a lot quicker for me to use AI to solve a problem. But I don't want it to replace me. And I think that's part of that challenge as well. And yes, as I mentioned, the states have some difficulty with that. I would add a third problem to both of these that you see, which in a way is much harder to manage, is the rise of social media. People have become very narrowly focused on their social media perspective, that the algorithm feeds them over and over and over again. When's the last time, and this is probably my generation guys, when's the last time you watched the news on Channel 5? At whatever time it is. Because it used to be our daily news came from there. When did you get the Straits Times to read? Because that's where your daily news came from. Now you wake up, you've got your Instagram feeds telling you exactly what's going on. You've got, YouTube telling you. So there's no more sort of common sort of narrative around. And this is, in Singapore, it's a lot easier to manage it. When I was in the US, everyone created their own reality around their own sense of media and technology and religion. And if you look at today, the United States, each side demonizes the other. The right Christians call the left as Antichrist, Antifa, and the left call them as radical fascist. They just demonize each other rather than try and find common ground. And then social media reinforces that, and the technology makes it so fast for these things to go around that governments just cannot deal with it. I mean, Singapore, there have been certain steps taken to try and slow it down, but you can't stop it. POFMA, the FICA rules. There's another one about online, election interference. This week is the Singapore International Cyber Week. And I had to moderate one of the panels yesterday. And every country is talking about election interference using technology. And Coordinating Minister Shanmugam actually did the keynote address and spoke about the challenges Singapore faces. And Singapore, in its own way, is trying to shut the door even after the horse is bolted, but at least we try in a small way. And, you've seen some of his ministerial statements last week, and people maybe don't pay much attention to him, but it's a real challenge. And if Singapore has so much difficulty, you can think of bigger countries where there's so much misinformation, disinformation coming out, whether it's about religion, whether it's with technology. Today, anytime you see anything, you're not sure, did AI create this or is this real? And you start questioning yourself and your ability to judge things when you see some of these things. So I think it's become far more challenging world for us to deal with. And the main point I said at the start, I think states have lost the ability in a way to regulate some of these things. We're trying very hard to now catch up. And there's very little global cooperation on this. That was the topic of my panel. Can we get global cooperation? It was very hard to find people coming to common grounds. So then, you sort of find what we call like-minded countries that try and find some areas of cooperation. But it's going to be more challenging in a way.
Maybe on a related... sorry? Oh, yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to jump off that question and go back to your opening statement, where you mentioned that ASEAN can cooperate. One of the areas ASEAN can cooperate more on is actually technology. Does that mean from a regulatory point of view, which is where you were getting at just now, or is it from a more economic or business point of view? And sort of a follow-up on that question, do we want to see ASEAN become more integrated like the EU is? Sorry. But then at the same time become perhaps more bureaucratic as the EU is, or does the ASEAN model work because it is more splintered?
Laissez-faire.
Yeah.
Obviously, I like laissez-faire because, again, ASEAN had a very different conception being conceived from the EU. The EU started because of 2 world wars on the European continent, and they wanted to prevent another world war between France and Germany and the challenges of that. And so as they started that, then they became, as they got bigger and bigger and bigger, they felt they needed to regulate better. They needed to create this idea of European citizen being able to move around freely. If you go to Europe, the Schengen Agreement allows you to go country to country without a passport once you get into one. And so these require certain bureaucratic requirements. Maybe they've gotten too much ahead of themselves on the bureaucratic bits of it. Why the British left as well. The British felt that, you don't sort of regulate the curvature of a banana because that was really an issue. How curved is it to be a banana? And now the Europeans themselves are starting to look at that. On the digital side, the European approach is to create more rules. And they're then opposed on the other side by the Americans that want the private sector, free enterprise to really push ahead with technology because they think rules will slow down the development of technology. And in a way, the Americans may be right. You don't know any big European tech company. There's one French tech company called Mistral, AI company. But, we all know about Google and Meta and Microsoft and Amazon because they believe in their model, just let the free market go rather than try to overregulate. And the Europeans they feel overregulated, so they're having a fight over digital trade rules. ASEAN, which is the start of your question, there's an opportunity to do things together. First, the standards are very different. So the first thing we need to do in the region is capacity building. Help Timor-Leste, which is joining ASEAN this weekend, Laos and others, come up to a certain level of capacity. Because whether they have the capacity or not, they still have the internet nodes that will connect them to the rest of our networks. And then to create with that sort of, yes, there has to be open digital policies, but you must have some domestic controls as well. Not to the extent that I was just reading, Cambodians are thinking of creating some sort of internet firewall to keep everything out because they're really subject to so many scams. That will disconnect them from the rest of the internet around the region. So how can you get the balance between what you want to do economically for your population and how you want to protect them as well? I think that's really that challenge, again, you were getting at. Are we just going to regulate or also we're going to promote? And some of the elements of their digital economic agreements being drafted and being considered for ASEAN, some of them are really trying to square this circle of do you regulate or do you promote or can you do both? How can you do both? I think that's where some of the opportunity may be for ASEAN to show that as a grouping, it doesn't necessarily have to be all 10 or 11. Maybe take the 3 or 4 or 5 that are now digitally quite savvy. Indonesia is very digitally savvy. Vietnam is very digitally savvy. Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines. Let's get something going and then give the others an opportunity with the capacity building to catch up with us and move forward with us. And there are things that can be done. I wouldn't want to see a world where everyone creates their own sort of blocked off internet, where everywhere you go, suddenly I need a VPN because I'm going to Cambodia in order to be able to see my... That becomes very challenging. That becomes a very challenging world for all of us. Well, I see technology as a positive, but I think we need some rules and we need some ethical standards and behaviors. And it's not the first thing we have to deal with. I mean, many years ago when nuclear weapons were founded, you had this sort of battle that led to mutually assured deterrence. And the big powers worked out a system in which they had rules in which they could manage nuclear weapons. They were never going to give it up. And even India and Pakistan have some rules how they manage conflict to avoid it going nuclear. So I think that we can find some rules and we can do that, but you're not going to stop nuclear power coming in and other aspects of it. Similarly with technology, I think you need to be able to square that circle.
Thanks, Ambassador. Maybe I can share some of my views and you can eat some more of your dinner in a way. So my name is Daniel Chia, currently the Deputy Chair supporting ITA for intellectual pursuit. So I really learned a lot, from the sharing, from the views and from the question. So I can't help but maybe ask a question more related to home. So we talk a lot about global, China, US. So I was actually thinking about Singapore itself, right? And what is really our identity in a way. So if you look at Singapore, in my own opinion, we are an Asia by itself. So actually, even you ask me, I don't think I'm really native, right? So I'm the third generation. My grandfather was from China. My sons, is in the fourth generation. They're going to the army tomorrow. So one trend that I witness or observe is that, the new citizen, the second gen, they start to be Singapore citizen and they just start to go to the army and serve the countries in a way. And that also triggered an interesting thought to me is that in the event, Singapore did an excellent job in terms of striking harmony, creating that kind of diversity. I think that's the strength and that's really what we are good at doing. But in time of, crisis, turmoil, emergency, so I'm just wondering, could we still protect ourselves and could we defend ourselves? So that's always a question that I ask myself. And maybe with Ambassador Ashok, you can share with you your views, who we are and really what's the identity of Singapore. And can we maintain this identity for the next, let's say, 60 years? Yeah.
We haven't done too badly for 60. I think the next 60 is a lot easier. Around this room is the Singapore identity, some PRs, maybe some non-citizens, non-PRs, but they form what we are. I think we've gotten a little bit too hung up in people sort of, are you a citizen? Are you a PR? Are you a new citizen? Are you a little bit... When our parents came, when our grandparents came. No one really bothered about these things. Now we've become all sort of fixated about this identity. And it's not just us, it's around the world. The British are going through this process as well. In America, they're going through this as well. So it's a little bit of a challenge. I think that Singapore has benefited, thank you, because we have been open to people coming from outside. In our time, I was born in 1959 when Singapore got self-independent. Self-governing, we're not self-independent from the British. And then, at that time, was still technically a British subject. In 1963, Singapore joined Malaysia. I became a Malaysian without leaving Singapore. In 1965, Singapore became independent, and I became Singaporean. It was pliable, it didn't matter. Many of you may have had the same experience as I did. You started being Brits, and then you suddenly became Malaysian, you suddenly became Singaporean. And so now if people are prepared to give up their citizenship to come to Singapore, to be part of us, I think we should be a little bit more welcoming rather than suspicious. And say, oh, fine, you come, there are certain things we do. Maybe you have to do a Singlish test before you can become Singaporean. You can do things like that, if you want to. But let's be a little bit more open, and then they will have children who will join the SAF, who will work in other institutions. We're never going to have enough people of our own. That's just the reality of Singapore. Today, 2025, you can already know what the workforce is going to be in 2045, because the 20-year-olds of 2045 are being born this year. And they're not enough. Maybe AI and robots will take over some of that, and you can even say what the population is going to be in 2065. And the older ones, we are living longer, and we become, the dependency ratios have changed so dramatically that without an infusion of young people coming in, we're always going to be challenged. And we have, I think, a fairly sensible immigration policy. Again, I lived in the United States, and President Trump is trying to reshape the immigration policy. He says no birthrights and citizenship, which Singapore does not allow anyway. You can come from Indonesia to have your child over here because we've got better medical facilities, but you actually sign a waiver that child cannot claim Singapore citizenship. So we do not allow birthright citizenship. His other complaint is that when people come in, they bring their parents, they bring their cousins along, once we let them come in on a visa. In Singapore, if you come in as a foreigner to work, you can bring your immediate family and your dependents. And when your children reach a certain age, they have to leave. Unless they themselves take PR, join the national service and carry on. Otherwise, they have to leave. So, in fact, the Americans are looking at us as possibly a model. Grumbling about H-1B visas paying $100,000 because that has been abused by many US companies to get cheap workers. We don't allow that. If you want to get someone foreigner to come and work, they must have a job that is at certain levels. So I think that we have to be a little bit more open on these things and let these people come in and become part of us. Guys, I keep saying this is my personal views. I'm not sure if everyone in the government, I think that we can accommodate a couple more million people, It's not that crowded, actually. Take the trains, certain peak hours, but I noticed that now on the Northeast Line, if you take the train early, you don't have to pay a fare. You can be a little bit practical about how you do these things, I think we can take in a little bit more diversity, a little bit more culture. I enjoy when I go out on weekends listening to people speaking in Myanmar at the Peninsula Plaza, speaking in Tagalog in Lucky Plaza, going to botanical gardens and see them all having... I see that as a very positive thing to be able to do. Why can't we just be more open and professionals coming in as well? So that identity will again keep changing. The identity of those Singaporeans in 1965 was a very different identity from the Singaporeans now in 2025. They had a very uncertain future. Many of the professionals actually left because they didn't think Singapore was going to survive. Singapore went through ups and downs. And we can get people into this history of Singapore without necessarily having been here from birth, and being a little bit more open to it. But that's my view. I think half of you may disagree with me, but I can live with that in my age.
Hi, Ambassador. Maybe while you are savoring your gelato, I will just. I was just thinking just now that you were saying that the current United Nations is a little bit of a dysfunction. Then I also understood that you are currently sitting on the board of Temasek International. So perhaps maybe from the angle of Temasek International and other what I would call state-affiliated organizations, perhaps in this time and age, how can you see state-affiliated organizations play a part in securing competitive advantages for their countries, maybe their effectiveness and limitations?
I don't speak for Temasek. I'm not on the Temasek board. I work for Temasek, but I'm not on the board. And Temasek is not a state-affiliated. Temasek operates commercially with Singapore government money, but that's all we do. So, like any commercial company, they just have to find the opportunities in the right places. And they have to keep looking at these opportunities as they emerge. There's no secret sauce to hard work, basically, which any company has to do anyway. Whether you are a small and medium-sized enterprise in Singapore, whether you're a large Singapore company, whether you're a foreign company that uses Singapore as the base, you just have to operate in that sort of context.
So, just want to return back to the topic of technology. I think we didn't really discuss this part. I think we are seeing the rise of this whole idea of techno-nationalism, where countries like America, they are weaponizing things like export controls and all tools of statecraft. So how can countries like Singapore and our companies defend against such a trend?
I think that let me separate it into two bits. Export controls is one thing that the US uses to punish people that do not follow what they think are the rules. So there are sanctions, there are export controls that they're able to use. North Korea, because they do not follow what the UN says to sort of denuclearize, is subject to UN sanctions. And the US has been the main person driving that sanctions. And so that is one part, and I think the US will continue to use that. And in a way, they feel that is a better tool than using a military weapon. So this is a new extension of foreign policy to include export and economic tools. And the Chinese will do the same. You remember when the Chinese and the Filipinos had a fight a few years ago, the Chinese stopped buying Philippine bananas and stopped allowing their tourists to travel to Philippines. And there will be other tools that the Chinese will be able to use as we become closely connected economically. I can just imagine the software in the BYD car just goes off because China is unhappy with you. So I don't know, just they turn it off. Who knows? That's what it's about. NVIDIA, I think, again, this administration hasn't quite worked through what they want to do with techno-nationalism. The previous Biden administration was very clear. We need to stop China having access to these chips because China will then be able to surpass us or copy these chips or whatever it is. They created this AI diffusion rule, if you remember, in early January with 3 tiers. Singapore was in tier 2. So we'll only sell to tier 1, which are largely NATO countries. We probably will not sell to tier 2 unless the US company is partnering you. And definitely not tier 3, which is North Korea, China, Russia, Iran. The Trump administration came in and threw the diffusion rule away. They said they weaponized the chips. But in a way, they told Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, you can still sell, but we take 15% of the tariff. And then Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, said, we should continue to sell China the chips because then they'll be dependent on us. which has always been the logic, the US logic. We'll continue to sell it to them. We will always get the better technology, and China will be dependent on us because they will not have the incentive to develop the new technologies. I think now the Chinese have seen through that and don't want to do that. So what will happen in this techno-nationalistic world, because you ask about Singapore, is people have to choose one technology or the other. It's like, you remember VHS and Betamax. Or for a time we had different, even for our mobile phones, you had a GSM system and something else, CDMA. So you will have a certain fragmented technological world, which will be more expensive, maybe a bit more inefficient. So I travel around the world a bit. When I go to the US, I'll have to take one particular device. When I go to China, I'll take another particular device. And that just makes it a little bit more complicated. But I cannot see US techno-nationalism as it's currently framed stopping countries from being able to buy their chips, putting aside China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. In fact, President Trump's first trip as president in this term was to the Middle East, where he opened up AI facilities in UAE and Saudi Arabia and wants to sell them the chips. So the US techno-nationalism is basically now built around what they call exporting the AI stack, which is you become part of mine. And the Chinese also want to export their technology stack. And there are countries that will buy that because it may be cheaper, maybe it's more easy to use, maybe some countries want to use it for some of the city cameras and things like that. And you will just find a fragmentation of the system. And Singapore will just have to navigate between these worlds because we do have Chinese companies here, we have American companies here, and we operate in both of those.
Sir, I just wanted to go and ask with regards about your own views regarding about China itself, because I personally would think that I'd be very skeptical regarding about whether or not China can truly be trusted or not, because Singapore, for instance, already had got itself burned through a number of incidents like the Suzhou Industrial Park fiasco, as well as especially the whole Tarex incident. Really goes to show about whether or not whether in this time of uncertainty can China truly be trusted, whether or not, and especially considering the fact that the world that we are living in is very much more or less evolving into something that's very similar to the Sengoku period in Japan.
I think people will have to make their own personal views about this thing and how they see China, whether they want to cooperate with China. It's not just Singapore. Every country will have to do it. As I mentioned earlier, Indonesia is buying Chinese fighter planes. They must have certain views about that. And I think each country will really have to decide on its own, and each individual in a way, whether they feel comfortable going to. I have American friends who now say, we don't want to go to China because we feel it's very unsafe. And I have Chinese friends say, I don't want to go to America because they feel very unsafe. Because they watch all the images on TV. And, I think that you don't take and paint a whole country with a particular brush. You just have to work with all of them. And particularly a small country like Singapore. We'll work with the US, we'll work with Europe, we'll work with China, we'll work with India and find those opportunities there. So I think that Singapore and China, Singapore being small, every country is bigger than us. The US is bigger than us, China is bigger than us, India is bigger than us. And the small guy just really has to learn how to survive in a very complicated world. And so far, we've been okay for 60 years. And maybe the next 60 as well, as the world becomes a little bit more complicated without the rules.
Yeah, when he's on the subject of China again, because earlier Effendi was talking about the world is not prepared for China to become number one. And we also say China doesn't want to be number one. But I think to me, it seems that China definitely want to be number one in Asia, at least to dominate. And actually, really what puzzles me all the time is that, the tension in the South China Sea, while China actually created tension, in the South China Sea, China is also investing into Asia. And China approach is very different towards Europe. It's the Belt and Road that actually helps economically. But in Asia, China is also, while at the same time investing in Asia, China is also creating the tension. We read about the Philippines, the fishermen being deprived of the, of the fishing grounds. So what is actually the Chinese thinking about? What's behind them? In actually creating the tension and also in investing. And can the US actually, is the US in a position to contain China in Asia?
Can I have some tea, please? Thank you. There's a view in international relations that big regional powers want to run the region. So everyone expects that China wants to be the regional hegemon. In fact, in today's world, if the United States is withdrawing from global commitments, they're supposed to come out with a new national defense strategy in a few weeks' time. And people tell me the national defense strategy is going to focus very much on what they call homeland security, preventing migrants coming into the US, and very much looking at Latin America as part of their geography, what they're doing in Venezuela and Colombia. And in that context, they will leave Asia to be China's, and they will leave Europe to be Russia's. I think that's a very simplistic view of looking at things. I don't think the US will give up that role. China definitely wants the region to be better connected to it. Economically, obviously, also security-wise. When an issue comes up that China feels strongly about, they want at least the Asian countries to support them on that. That's influence is not just about pure power. It is also about how can you influence countries. They work very hard. They had a summit of African leaders because they also want Africa to be supportive of them. And for the countries of the region, I think most see China as essentially a good. The trade relationships between Singapore or Southeast Asia and China have grown dramatically as China joined the WTO and became an economic player. I think we would all be poorer in this region if we did not have China, as a significant economic partner. Whether that economic relationship then carries on into, because they say something, we'll always agree with them, I think that's a different matter. There will be areas on the South China Sea, for example, where countries of Southeast Asia have a different view from China. Even though we may be all our largest trading partner, is China, we don't have similar views about the South China Sea. We don't have a similar view about Taiwan. We use different language for Taiwan. And so there were differences in terms of how I described just now when DPM Gunn went to the parade, he used different language as well. So I think that there will be nuances and subtleties in how we deal with China, even though we do recognize that China is the biggest country in the region. I spent time in Indonesia. I was ambassador to Indonesia. Indonesia is bigger than Singapore. If you remember, President Habibie said, "You're just a little red dot." We accept that there's almost an abang-adik relationship with Indonesia. They're the bigger brother, we're the smaller brother. But we also expect that Indonesia will respect that as a brother, they've got certain responsibilities to us as well. It's not just a one-way sort of relationship. And we will hold our own. If Indonesia tries to push us around, we will push back. And they've seen that. And we just deal with that. And so similarly, China will have to sort of deal with countries that will sometimes push back. The Indians will obviously not accept China as a regional hegemon. The Japanese will not. I doubt the Koreans will. The Filipinos. So the China will need to navigate that. Yet they bring a lot of economic benefits to the region. We're not going to walk away. On the flip side, the largest investor in Singapore for the past umpteen years has been the United States. We're not going to push the US away. 2/3 of foreign investment in Singapore come from the United States. China is not number 2. Europe is number 2. China is sort of not significant in investing in Singapore. We don't go around and see Chinese companies creating large manufacturing facilities. You see a lot of America. And so we will continue to be connected to the US as well. And so it's walking that fine line with economically we're linked to both and we'll partner both of them.
I think we have covered quite good ground. Maybe you want to ask an ambassador if there's any hard truths you're taking away, from your rich history of experience across, all your different post days and all. What's one hard truth that we need to formally impact?
I think the message I give generally to audiences in Singapore is we need to spend more time in Southeast Asia. We all need to know Southeast Asia much better. You, your children, need to spend more time in Southeast Asia. This is really our hinterland for what we do. And they're warm, friendly people. And the more time we spend with them, the better we understand. I think that's where the opportunities for us come out. I know Japan is a cheap place to travel to, but so are many Southeast Asian countries. So it's the more time we spend in Southeast Asia, I think the better. I spent a long time away from Singapore, most of it in Southeast Asian countries. And I think I benefited from that. Made many friends in the region and stay connected with them. And I think that's where the benefit for Singapore comes. Not by itself isolated, not just looking at US and China, but also looking at our own region as really a key partner. Hard truth.
All right. Yeah, I think we're come to the end of tonight's roundtable discussion. Please join me in giving Ambassador a big round of applause.